In this lecture, I want to sum up the sort of advantages of virtue ethics in general. And in all these lectures, I've focused on Aristotle's form of virtue ethics. In the Western world, Aristotle's form of virtue ethics is by far the most influential. Even people who develop their own form of virtue ethics usually take Aristotle as an inspiration. But by no means is Aristotle's form of virtue ethics the only one. There are, even though we haven't talked about them, you know, there are philosophers in the Western tradition, Hegel and Hume are two good examples, who develop their own forms of virtue ethics that depart pretty substantially from Aristotle's. Both Hegel and Hume, some of these issues I've said about, Aristotle's version being too unrealistic, they agree and try to moderate their form of virtue ethics in a way. Outside of the Western tradition, one way that a lot of people read Confucian ethics is as a form of virtue theory. So, you know, there are other forms besides Aristotle. And in my conclusion here, I just want to say something about the entire virtue ethics approach, Aristotle's approach, as well as other forms of virtue theory that might not completely go with Aristotle, right? Virtue ethics, this idea that, moral reasoning should be focused on questions of character, that it should see good behavior as more a matter of skillful behavior, a matter of, what I call knowing how rather than following rules. All of those are going to be present in other forms of virtue ethics. And you could develop those without necessarily being an Aristotelian. But I want to say something about just virtue ethics in general as well as Aristotle's form, both the advantages and the disadvantages. So, just to sum up, let's talk about the advantages of this virtue ethics approach. Aristotle's form of virtue ethics, as well as other forms of virtue ethics, are going to capture an important part of our moral thinking, right? Look, when we talk about morality, it's not just moral rules or consequences that we talk about. If I explain why something was a good thing to do, I often will say, well, that was brave, or that was honest, or that was generous, right? On the other side of the coin, in explaining why something is bad, it's often natural to reach for virtue theory terms. That was cruel, right? We'll talk about the vices. That was stingy. That was dishonest. That was cowardly. We do talk in these terms when we evaluate people and their actions. Concern for character and what our actions say about our character, that's important. It's not just whether we follow the moral rules as Kantianism and natural law theory would have it, or what kind of consequences we bring about with our actions. Deeper issues of character, what the actions say about us as a person, those seem to be important. Virtue ethics captures that in a way that the other moral theories we've looked at don't. Well, and then there's the issue that we talked about that was raised by Wolff's piece, right? This idea that we do think that the moral life and a good life should be linked in some way, right? We wouldn't put so much effort in trying to make sure that our children or those we care about are good people, much less that we are good people, if we didn't think that there was some link between a good life and a morally good life. As we've seen, Kantianism, utilitarianism don't seem to be able to explain that, right? How is doing your duty going to be a good life for you? Doesn't seem to be any link, right? How is bringing about the best consequences going to be a good life for you? In fact, with utilitarianism, it seems worse because bringing about the best consequences often requires us to give away or give up a lot of the things that make our own lives good. Virtue theory, on the other hand, in talking about the importance of relations with others, in talking about the kind of life you want to live as a whole, and the link between that and these good traits of character, these virtues, it can give an account of how a good life and a morally good life are linked. Finally, virtue theory seems to have a more nuanced and subtle way of evaluating people and their actions than Kantianism or utilitarianism, or than natural law theory for that matter, even though I didn't put it in the slide. Look, Kantianism, it's all about do you follow the rule or not? Do you do your duty? Natural law theory, it's all about do you respect the intrinsic goods or not? That's a sort of 1 or 0, black or white sort of thing. Utilitarianism, do you bring about the best consequences? Again, 1 or 0, black or white sort of thing. You do or you don't. As we've seen with virtue theory, there's this whole sort of, spectrum, or this whole sort of ascending stairway, right? Virtue ethics can allow that you haven't done anything bad, maybe, but maybe it could be better, right? There's vice, incontinence, continence, and virtue, and even in virtue, there are many levels of virtue. If I help another person out when I should, but I don't like doing it, well, that's not a bad thing, the virtue ethicist would say, but we can explain why you're not as good as somebody who truly enjoys doing the right thing. Kantianism, when it's all about duty or not, doesn't seem to be able to do that. Utilitarianism also doesn't seem to be able to do that. Natural law theory, it's all about respecting the intrinsic goods or not. This idea that there's subtle steps, that there's shades of gray all the way up, doesn't seem to fit in those theories. Virtue theory seems to fit in there more naturally, right? If I, the idea is, someone like Fred Rogers, he might be exceptionally virtuous. I'm not a bad person, but I'm not as virtuous as he is. Virtue theory might be able to explain how these saints are better than the rest of us in a way that these other moral theories can't. All right, so of course there are disadvantages to virtue ethics. And not just to Aristotle's form of virtue ethics, but virtue ethics as an approach. Well, one thing to notice, I talked a lot about how Aristotle's cultural assumptions might have affected the way he defines the virtues. I think it's going to be hard for any form of virtue theory not to start with controversial assumptions that might be loaded by one's own background, one's own culture. Virtue ethics starts with this idea of what a good person and a good life for a human being looks like. Well, when you do that, you're going to make some controversial claims. If I give you some idea of what the morally perfect or virtuous person looks like, there's a good chance that you are not going to agree with whatever moral ideal I cite, right? If I tell you what a good life for a human being is, well, there's even more chance you're going to disagree, right? Now look, Aristotle is not, I think, as aware of this as we are, right? Aristotle lived in a society where everyone he was talking to, they were all educated, free Greek men. They all had a common cultural background. If Aristotle said, well, let's think of the ideally virtuous person, and one of his students said, well, who's that? What does he look like? Aristotle could say Socrates or Solon or somebody like that, and the student would be like, oh, okay, yeah, that's a good person, right? In our culture, we don't have as much in the way, or we can't assume as much of a shared background as Aristotle could. If you say, well, who's an ideally good person? And I say, well, Jesus, right? What would Jesus do? And you say, well, actually, no, I'm an atheist, or no, I'm a Muslim, or, you know, I'm a Buddhist. Or even if we go with somebody not in a religious tradition, if you say, well, what's the ideally virtuous person look like? And I quote, I give you some example of a military hero, say, Sergeant York, right? And you say, no, I'm a pacifist. I think war is always wrong. I just don't agree to that. We're going to have a lot more trouble agreeing what a good person and a good life looks like than Aristotle is going to have in his society. And if we can't agree on that, we might have a really hard time working out what the virtues are and what they look like. We might not be able to get the theory off the ground, or at least we might not be able to develop it in a way that allows us to discuss and debate with people who don't share our background and assumptions. And in our society, unlike ancient Greek society, we will have to discuss and debate with people like that. So, and on this point, Kantianism and utilitarianism seem to do a lot better. They don't require these controversial assumptions about what a good life looks like or what a good person is that Aristotle needs. All utilitarianism needs is, well, pleasure good, pain bad. Whatever our background, we can admit that. It's just the way those things feel. Kant, all he needs is, well, you think you are worthy of respect. You think that other people ought to respect you and your decisions. Well, nothing makes you special. Other people have reason. Other people think the same thing. That's way less controversial than the assumptions Aristotle, or indeed I think any form of virtue ethics, is going to have to make about what a good person and a good life looks like. In this respect, at least, it seems that virtue theory has some of the same problems that we saw with natural law theory. 2, virtue ethics in a way seems to put the focus in the wrong place. It's self-centered, you might say. Well, what do I mean by this? Well, I do think talk of virtue, talk of character, is an important part of the way we think about and talk about morality. But how big a part is it really? Think about this. If you lie to a friend and I say that's wrong, I'm like, lying to a friend is wrong, right? And I just keep talking about how lying to a friend is wrong because it says bad things about your character. It shows that you are dishonest. It shows that you are unjust, especially to a friend. It shows that you are, I don't know, but it shows all kinds of vices, right? Or if I say, well, what's wrong with, killing an innocent person for money? And the response is, well, that shows injustice, that shows, lack of proper ambition, you want bad things. It shows, cowardice maybe, you're not willing to face, maybe you're doing it for financial difficulties, you're not willing to face the consequences. Just keep going that way, right? Notice what all of this misses, though, is what these actions do to their victim. It makes it about the character of you. It focuses it all on you, your character. It doesn't talk about what these bad actions do to the other person. And if anything, what these bad actions do to the other person seems more important than what doing them says about your character. Why is it wrong to lie to someone? Well, because by lying to this person, you harm them. Kantianism and utilitarianism have a natural account here, right? Utilitarianism, when you lie to another person, you almost certainly create all this misery and unhappiness for them that didn't exist before, especially if you lie to them about something important. Kantianism, you use this person in a way that other human beings shouldn't be used. You fail to respect them. What's wrong with killing an innocent person? Well, utilitarianism, you deprive them of happiness. You create all this misery in society. Kantianism, again, you fail to show this person the respect they deserve. You treated a human being in a way that no one should ever be treated. That seems much more natural. That seems much better than talking about what it says about someone's character. What it says about someone's character, well, that seems important. That seems secondary, though, right? This other stuff about what the bad action does to the victim, that seems more important than anything you might say about what it says about the person who does its character. Finally, 3, and this ties back to 1, virtue ethics might be conservative in a bad way. And I don't mean conservative in any link with conservative as we talk about it in our politics. What I mean by this is, if we take our ideal of what a good life is and what a good person is from our culture and we start and stop there, start and end there at least, well, it might deprive us of the ability to rethink assumptions in our culture that are bad, right? I mean, think of it this way, right? In Aristotle's society, there was slavery. No one in Aristotle's society, very few people at least, seem to question it, right? If you were in Aristotle's society and you're thinking about any person you might think of as virtuous, none of them would probably seriously question slavery. So you would not question this cultural assumption because none of the virtuous people do. The same goes for, say, the treatment of women in Aristotle's society. Kantianism, utilitarianism, once again seem to do better. We can question the assumptions of our own society if we ask if they respect people as ends in themselves. We can question them if we think about, does it create the most happiness? If we ask ourselves, well, what would the virtuous person think, or what's virtuous about this, and our models of virtue, our ideals of what a good life and a good person look like, are off, well, it's just not going to occur to us that a good or virtuous person might have problems with this. Now, there are responses virtue theorists could make to this. They could say, well, maybe there are certain morals, exemplars, or exceptionally virtuous people who just see it and they show the rest of us the way. I'm not sure. Again, this gets back to this, maybe virtue ethics sets the bar too high. These other moral theories, Kantianism, utilitarianism especially, seem to give us a better way to question the assumptions of our own society, to measure them and see if they're really good or really bad. They seem to be better at that than does virtue theory. Okay. So I'll stop there, End of this unit. I want you guys to do the case studies for virtue theory. The one thing we'll do in the next unit before we do the final projects and the final paper in the class, I want to say a little bit about the fact that all of these theories seem to have some things going for them. They all seem to have some problems. What do we do with that fact? We'll say something about that in the next lecture, which will also be the final lecture. You guys shouldn't be, hopefully you're not too happy about that, but this will be, this is the next to last. After this unit, the next will have only one of these.